We're shouting this morning because the mic's not working, evidently. I'm Bert Moore. I'm Dean of the School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences. And on behalf of the Center for Children and Families, I want to welcome you to today's talk. I was thinking on the way over here how to talk to you about what the Center for Children and Families does. And we have a mission statement, we have objectives, we have goals, we have programs. But as I was thinking about it, what we do is think pretty much all the time about how do children best develop and what do families need to make sure that that is true. And so our mission, as we see it, is how can we live out the promoting of optimal development in children. We do that through various things that the Center for Children and Families does. And I have to brag about the wonderful faculty and students and postdocs that make that true. We have just a terrific group of faculty, graduate students, master's, PhD, undergraduates, postdoctoral fellows, all of whom are committed to this endeavor to think, how do we best help children? We do this through creating new knowledge, conducting research. We do it through outreach programs and support of professionals in the community, but also parents who are concerned about their own children. We have resources that they can turn and get help on where to refer for questions that they're interested in. We have selected group of direct service programs. We bring national thought leaders to the community. We conduct workshops for professionals. And then we have these public lecture series, drawing upon the expertise that exists in the school. So we're really pleased that you've come this morning to hear Dr. Mandy Maguire, and she'll be introduced in just a moment. We have a continuing series of these talks that will be going on the rest of the spring, and we will be doing additional programming next year. So we hope you stay in touch with us. Tell us what you would like us to do that you think would be in promoting of our objectives. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Deb Wiebe, who will present Mandy Maguire.
Yeah, one of the fun things about being able to work with the faculty and staff for the center is that I get to work with these wonderful people that Bert was talking about, and I get to introduce them to you when they give a lecture. So our speaker today is Dr. Mandy Maguire, who joined the faculty here at UT Dallas in 2005. She got her BA in psychology from Penn State, and after working as a research assistant at Carnegie Mellon for 1 or 2 years, she completed her PhD in developmental psychology with Kathy Hirsch-Pasek. For those of you who were here for the forum in January, many of you may have met her. This was Mandy's mentor. She did a postdoc at the University of Louisville before she came and joined us here at UT Dallas. She is here at UT Dallas in the School for Behavioral and Brain Sciences, and she has labs both at the Callier Center for Communication Disorders as well as the UTD Center for Brain Health. Her research focuses on language acquisition and development in infants and children who are typically developing. And in one of the interests when she came here was for her to be able to collaborate with researchers who also study communication disorders and to understand the neurocognitive processes that are involved not only with typically developing language, but also with what happens when things go wrong in language across the lifespan. In the process of doing that, she's able to understand more about how to develop interventions that are effective and also to understand the processes of normal development. So we're in for a treat today. She has received awards for her teaching, and I think we'll have a good lecture on, I don't see the title up there, but it's something like language acquisition in infants and toddlers. So please join me in welcoming Mandy.
Thank you. everybody, for coming. I'm so glad you were able to make it here from whatever parking lot you were able to find somewhere to park in. Let me put up the beginning of mine so we have the title. That'll be good. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is language development in infants and toddlers. And kind of what we had just said, I'm going to talk a lot about typical development as opposed to atypical development. And I'm going to talk a lot about, or I'm going to talk only about speech production and comprehension. So Anne Van Cleek will be speaking about literacy in a future lecture, and we'll hear more about infant cognitive development from Melanie Spence in a future lecture, which hopefully you can all attend. But this one is really going to be focusing on typical language development. And I didn't want to go through the kind of basic milestones. You can kind of get that online, really, from different resources. So instead, my goal today is to kind of tease apart science and what we know from recent science on language development compared to how it gets portrayed in popular press and especially in products that are being sold to parents and to teachers. In the last probably about 15 or 20 years, we've made amazing headway in learning more about brain development, infant knowledge, what infants are able to do, what abilities they come to the world already having when it comes to language processing and language abilities that makes it so that they can acquire this really complex skill. So I want to tell you a lot about those aspects. In doing this, I'm going to kind of give a review of basic language features for people who may not know, with the idea of showing you exactly how complex this skill is that children have to acquire. And in there, I'm going to tell you some of the abilities that infants and toddlers possess, really without ever being overtly taught these things. When we get to the ideas of how is that possible, that kind of brings us into this classic nature-nurture debate. And the end result right now is that we know it's not all nature or all nurture. It's a mix of both. So I'm going to tell you some of where we stand on all of that, what we know comes from the biology of humans that makes it possible for us to acquire language, as well as what in the environment matters. So really, what can parents and what can teachers do to help children acquire the quality of language that they need to succeed in the environment that we have? And then I'm just going to do a little bit of the science behind science-based products. So you hear these claims about, oh, brain development is this, so you have to buy this. And I kind of want to go through and tell you whether that would actually work or not. So maybe save you a couple $100 on some products. We'll see. Yes. Oh, I don't have it on. Do I need to put it? OK. This is, if you want to get a video of this later, because you love it so much, we will have that available. So the first thing I want to talk about then is phonology. Anybody who's had a language class would know what this is. This is really the system of sounds or phonemes that we have within a language. The human mouth and vocal cords can create about 200 different sounds. No language has all of them. What we do is we kind of pick those sounds out of the whole array. So English, depending on the dialect you speak, has about 40 different sounds that we produce. And these are things like ba and pa. It's really important to be able to hear the difference between ba and pa, to hear the difference between bat and pat, or bath and path. And there's actually very small differences between those. If you produce those sounds, you can see how similar they are to each other. But children have to figure out how all variations of the ba sound are the same. When men say it, it sounds different than when women say it. It sounds different than when children say it. And different accents may come out a little different. Every time they have to hear it as ba. And they have to hear it as distinct from pa, or they're not going to be able to acquire their language. So what we see is that they're going to have to learn that system of sounds that's in their language to figure out how to produce it, how to hear it, how to comprehend it each time it comes around. Other languages then have different sounds. And what we want is to focus in on the sounds of our language, because that's the language we want to learn. Now, this makes it harder as we get older to acquire other languages. So you'll find that there's sounds that are as diverse and easy to hear as clicks that are used in a lot of African languages, like those sounds that you can kind of hear. I can't project that as well. And different kind of vowel sounds. So when you acquire a second language and people say to you, no, 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 you're saying it wrong. Say it like this, and it sounds identical to you. This is because you have the phonology of your language and not the language that you're trying to acquire. So along with these basic production and comprehension aspects, there are rules for combining these sounds. And some of these are things you probably don't even know you have. So this is where we're going to do a little class participation. These are two crazy animals I found that do exist. I made up names because their real names did not work in my example. So I'm going to tell you that what we have on the left is a blick. Everybody say it's a blick. OK. And on the right, what you have is a wug. OK. So I have one blick here. Now, if I had two of them, I would have two what? Blicks. OK. Now, if I have one wug and then I have two of them, I'll have two what? OK. So what did you do when you did that? One thing was that you added an S to the end of it to make it plural, right? But you actually did a lot more. If you listen to what you said wugs and blicks. So when you say blicks, you're actually adding an S to the end of that. When you say wugs, you're adding a Z. So why did you do that? Well, the reason you did that is that you are a native English speaker, probably. And this is a rule in English that we have. So I'm going to have you do more participation, because I found if you don't actually make the noise, this doesn't work. So what I want you to do is the only difference between the S sound and the Z sound has to do with whether your vocal cords vibrate or not. So I want you to put your fingers here and make an S sound. Go S. All right, now make a Z sound. OK, you feel the difference? OK, in English, when we have two consonants together, you have to match for voicing. So what happens is on blicks, your vocal cords don't vibrate, so you put on an S. On wugs, they do when you make that G sound. So you put on a Z. All right, this is a really complicated rule, and you probably didn't even know you had it. It's not a rule that we are forced to do. Other languages don't follow this rule. This is a rule in English. So children actually follow this rule by the age of 4. They accurately do this. No one teaches it to them. No one sits them down and makes them practice with their vocal cords to make sure they get it right, but they learn it. They learn it without being overtly taught. So phonology in itself, this aspect that most people don't even think about in language development, is a really complicated set of rules that children have to acquire. The next one I want to talk about is kind of more in line with what we think of, which is semantics, or word meanings. And in language development, the real question is, how do children know what a label refers to? In the whole world of things, when you think about all the objects that are in a kid's playroom, and they hear a new word, how on earth do they know what to put that word to? So we're going to do another example. All right, so in this one, if we look at this and I say, oh my gosh, there's a blicket. OK, now we come over here. Which one's the blicket, A, B, or C? C. All right, C, right? Just make sure you said C. OK. So when you made that decision, you did it quickly, and you did it following a bunch of rules that, again, you may not realize you have. You didn't choose A, and you didn't choose A because that's a boy. And you have a label for boy. You don't need another label for boy. If that were another crazy animal that I found online, you might be confused and not know which one to put it to. But because you have a label for boy, you ignore that. That's a rule called mutual exclusivity. Now, for B, you don't put it to B because that's part of the object. That's not the whole object. And we don't label parts of objects initially. We label whole objects, which in a really hard name is called the whole object assumption. So these are two rules that are very, very logical, make a whole lot of sense. For adults, you can all follow the same rules and get to the same conclusion. And children follow these by 16 months of age. Again, no one sits them down and teaches it to them. No one says, no, honey, you can't put every word onto your favorite toy. We've got to spread those words around. They figure it out. So these are really impressive things that children are able to do even without being overtly taught. The last one I want to talk about is kind of the really important one in language. This is syntax, which is the rules that we use to create language, the rules for putting words together. And syntax gives us the biggest power in language. What we have is the ability to create an infinite number of novel sentences and meanings from a really limited vocabulary. So even though we have probably 100,000 words in our vocabulary, we create more than 100,000 concepts constantly. And we have a way to do that through grammar. Basically, every sentence you produce in here, you've never produced before or heard before, but you can understand it. So I'm going to give you some sentences that are short sentences, but probably ones you haven't heard before. So if I say the blue pigs from Texas sang, and you look at that sentence, well, these are words you've probably had, depending on what state you're from, in your vocabulary since you were about 3 years of age, probably even younger. but you've never heard them in this order before. And by hearing them in this order, I can create an image that's in my mind and put it into all of your minds. So you may have pictures in your head of little blue pigs singing, and they may have Texas flags or not, but you have an idea of what I'm talking about without it needing to be here. And the power of that is through the order of the words that I put it in. You've heard all of these words before, but the order gives you that new concept. And I can change this around really easily. So the pigs from Blue, Texas sang. Well, now the pigs can be pink, but they're from a town outside of Austin that I found that is called Blue. So it's small, but it's there. So now you have a different concept in your head, still unique, one you've never heard before, but different from the other one. And then a last one, the pigs from Texas sang Blue, which is a Joni Mitchell album. And I think Sarah McLachlan, too. So now you don't know where the pigs are from, but you have an idea of what they're singing. Well, this is pretty impressive. These are words, 6 little words you've had your whole life, and now you have 3 new concepts based on the order. It's not infinite, though. If I put in from sang pigs the Texas Blue, you get no concept, because I didn't follow a word order. So this is the real power of language, is in how we put words together. And again, children are really impressive when we look at this. So I'm going to show you this video of Prachi. Her name is Prachi. She is the 2-year-old daughter of a researcher who works at the Center for Brain Health, Dr. Raksha Anand. So she was nice enough to videotape. This was right before she turned 2. Her talking to Prachi. And I want you to listen to how she puts words together. She's just starting to do it, so it comes near the end, but she's pretty good.
Who takes you to daycare every day? Prachi's daycare. How do you go to daycare? How do you go? Okay, you go in car. Okay. Do you go in, what kind of car do you go in? Big car. Big car. Big car. Oh, you go in a big car?
So there's Prachi describing what kind of car she goes in. And already at 2 years of age, she's putting words together, and she's putting them together in ways that are meaningful. She doesn't arbitrarily put words in strange orders. So big car actually means something different than car big, which would be really focusing on the size of it. Prachi's daycare means something very different than daycare Prachi, which doesn't have any meaning to her. So one of the things we've learned is that even from the earliest times children are putting words together, they're not in arbitrary orders. They're creating new meanings based on the way words are put together. So again, we have this really complex set of rules that children are following from a young age. So in my overview of language, I really want to just highlight that language is this set of multiple complex abstract rules, many of which are never overtly taught. In fact, most of them aren't. Children figure them out from the environment. They have a way of learning these things from the environment. But by age 4, they've pretty much mastered it. That's amazing. When we think of other complex skills like calculus, we don't think a 4-year-old's going to do that. But these are really complex. You didn't even know you were following the Blix-Wugs thing, probably, unless you've taken my class before. So this is pretty impressive, and it brings us to the question that is our main question for language development. How is this possible? And then how can we influence this based on the environment kids are in? How can we give them the optimal environment for acquiring the best language possible for them? So this brings us to that kind of nature-nurture debate. And I'm just going to give you a setup here and then kind of walk you through this. In terms of nature or biology, humans and only humans are biologically wired to learn language at birth. This is one of the things we've, again, been kind of one of the newer findings in the last couple of decades. But children come into the world ready to acquire language. And they're neurologically kind of wired to do that, and then to become really good at language at a young age. But this wiring is influenced by the environment. So the environment matters a lot for the quality and quantity of language that children acquire. And it matters in a couple really specific ways that we're starting to learn about. One is how much language they hear. But even more important is the kind of language that they hear. So we'll go through each of these to kind of talk about what children are learning and how. So only humans have language. We can get communication in other species. So if you look at even dogs, they have this multiple range of communicative abilities, right? We have really angry dog. The little Chihuahua does not want you to touch the bone, and you can get that. You get that from this look. You have a really happy Siberian Husky and then a really sad puppy beagle. And then you have a dog that's just attentive and ready to do whatever someone tells them to do. So across animals, we can get a wide range of communications, but these are not language. These dogs can't talk about how they were angry yesterday, but today they're really happy about things. They can only talk about the here and now and not talk about, kind of give expressions about. Even the most complex languages that we see out in other species are nowhere near the complexity of what we have in human language. They don't have that core ability to create infinite numbers of meanings. So this makes language somewhat difficult to study compared to other areas of cognition. When you think about memory, well, rats actually have really good memory. So I can teach a maze to a rat, give it a drug, see if it gets better, take out part of its brain, see if it gets worse. IRB will not let me do that with children. I am not allowed to just put them in a language environment that has, only B sounds and nothing else and see what happens. So it puts us a little bit behind. Now, one of the ways we've tried to overcome this is through teaching language to other species. So primates, I'm going to discuss primates. We've tried this with quite a few different species. We've attempted to teach primates sign language usually. And kind of the best known is Coco, who is a lowland gorilla. This is her with her kitten, which Coco was very, very popular. She's still alive and signing and doing all of that. She was on the cover of National Geographic. She was in a Nova special that Martin Sheen even was the voiceover for. So she's a very famous gorilla. And her language was impressive. After 14 years of daily training, where she's rewarded for everything she does, she could understand about 2,000 words and produce about 1,000 signs. That's impressive. That's really good. But an average 14-year-old human who does not get constant feedback about their language has 45,000 words in their vocabulary. So we're able to get what might kind of constitute language, but it's nowhere near what we have in humans. The real question becomes syntax. That's words. She has word meanings. And that's been a lot harder to test. Coco's owners don't really let other people come in and test her. So we don't know. There's a lot of debate about her abilities. People who work with her say they're really, really good, and please give them more money. And people who study it from the outside say probably not quite as good. Where we have done this is with another chimp. So this in the suit, because he's ready for his picture, is Nim Chimpsky. If you know the name Noam Chomsky, it was a takeoff on that. So Nim Chimpsky, they wanted to do a lot more research to see what he could really learn when it comes to grammar. And when we study this, we talk about it in terms of mean length utterance, which is the number of words you put together. And the number of words you put together, as it grows in complexity, shows grammar development. So Prachi, who you saw, was putting together 2 words once in a while, but really most of the time only had 1-word utterances. So she'd be at about 1.2. So the question was, what was Nim able to do? And they've kind of studied this really well in comparison to typically developing kids. And these are actually typically developing kids and then children who are deaf who are also learning sign. So what we see is right down here is Nim's ability to put words together. And what you'll see in all of these other kids, these are kids who have really intense diary studies where they're studied kind of daily, weekly, they keep track of the progression of the kids, is even in the slowest ones that they could find, which are these 2 here who are both learning to sign, they hit a point where they just take off and start putting lots and lots and lots of words together. And Nim never hits that. He gets to about 2 words. There's some indication that he put as many as 16 words together, but if you look at this, it makes no sense. This isn't the way humans do this. So a child who puts 16 words together creates more meaning by putting more words together. What Nim did was give orange me, give eat orange me, eat orange, give me, eat orange, give me you. That's not what we would get out of human language. So it's qualitatively different. Even when we get these species to getting to what might be putting words together, it's not human language. Also, Nim's productions were mainly direct imitations. So someone would sign something to him, he'd sign it directly back. In human children, only 2% of productions are direct imitations. So again, even when we try to teach these species different language abilities, comes nowhere near human abilities. Now, when you flip this, so this is all this work we've put into these species, these primates who are 99% the same in terms of genetics. All of this effort, and this is what we get. But when you look at humans, all humans have language. And again, this is typically developing humans, but all humans have language. All over the world, there are hundreds of thousands of languages. And you put two people together, you can't stop them from having a language. All languages are equally complex. There's no such thing as a primitive language. So on the flip side of what we have in other species, you really can't stop language from occurring. One of the other oddities, which I kind of mentioned, is that children are better at learning it than adults. And again, this is really one of the only complex skills we have that is this way, that children can do it and adults really have a problem with it. Along with that is kind of, again, one of the newer findings that we have, which is not only are children going to do it, they'll do better at it, all humans will have it, but children can create language if it's not already there. And there was some indication of this previous to this, but now there's a large amount of documentation on this language, the Nicaraguan Sign Language. And it's the first indication we have where we've actually mapped this and watched it over time. What happened was in Nicaragua in the late 70s and early 80s, they brought together all of these children who had been raised in rural, very separated areas of Nicaragua without any sign language. They usually had kind of individual gestures or home signs that they would use with their parents around them. Most children who are born deaf are born to hearing parents, so they didn't have a sign language that they were given. So across this country, there were a bunch of children who basically didn't have any language. They had a few signs, and they brought them all together in a school for the deaf. So as they brought these kids together, the teachers tried to teach them, it's not real clear what they tried to teach them, but some type of sign language to allow them to learn language. And they tried, and they were getting really frustrated because they were saying the kids weren't learning anything. And then suddenly they realized the kids were talking to each other. They were signing to each other and making a whole lot of sense to each other, having whole conversations. And the teachers had no idea what they were saying. So they called in linguists to look at this, and they said, what are they saying? And the linguist said, we don't know. So they started studying it and found it was a completely new language that these children had created. The youngest children in it were the best at it. And it's completely as complete as any other language we have. They have the similarity in a sign language to phonemes. They have semantics. They have grammar, every aspect of language that we have. And it was created by the children. So as opposed to these chimps and apes that we've tried so hard to get language and they don't get it, these kids created their own. So you basically can't stop language in humans, and especially in children. So we get to some of why are children better at language? Why is it that children are able to do this? And we're just kind of getting the tip of the iceberg on some of this. One thing is that, and I'm only going to talk about a little bit of what we know in infants, because Melanie Spence will be talking about that later in another talk that you should come to. So we know that human infants are kind of primed to learn language from the time that they are born. One of the big findings that really shows this is that children can differentiate all the sounds or phonemes of all of the languages of the world when they're born. They lose this ability by 12 months. So sounds that you can't hear the difference between when you're trying to learn that foreign language, a newborn infant can. And they're better at it. They can hear every sound of every language and differentiate it. Well, that's pretty cool. And they're a lot better at it than we are. So they seem to be kind of primed and ready for language. And when we look at this, it seems like they're born with a brain that's wired to be in any environment and do really well in that environment, and then specializes based on the experiences around it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how the brain develops to explain this, and also because the popular press stuff on early brain development has been really, they've talked a lot about it, which is great, because what you'll see is early brain development is very, very fast. A lot of things happen really, really early, which makes that early environment really important. But how it then gets sold is sometimes not quite as accurate. So early brain development happens quite differently than I think most people assume. When we talk about early brain development, we're talking about the creation of the cells that are in the brain, which are neurons. And before birth, you actually create all of the neurons that you're going to have your whole life. So the creation of neurons begins about 3 weeks after conception, and is pretty much complete 18 weeks after conception. So you have all the brain cells that you're ever going to have right now. You're not getting any more, and you've had them since you were born. So this is obviously then in prenatal development a really important time. So throughout gestation, it's a rate of 250,000 neurons created per minute. That's amazing. So we get all of these neurons. I'm going to use lots of big numbers as we go through this. So this is how we get the cell bodies. The cell bodies aren't the most important part, though. The most important part is the communication between cell bodies, the firing between them. How do they talk to each other? Those are called synapses. And also, very early in development, we have a large period of synaptogenesis, the creation of synapses. And again, it starts about 5 weeks after conception, so really early, and it's actually largely complete by the age of 2. So if you look on here, we have, on the left you have your newborn, and you can see there's lots of neurons there, but there's no connections between them. So by about 3 months, you can see a lot more connections. The neuron bodies are getting bigger. And by 2 years, it's this massive mix of all of these connections between the neurons. So again, to get one of our big numbers out there, from 2 months after birth to about 2 years, you make 1.8 million new synapses per second. So early development is just this constant, all of those neurons that you created are now connecting to each other. What we have in a 2-year-old's brain, though, isn't very efficient. It's really great, they can all talk, but it's like having a city where every house has a road to every other house and restaurant and theater in that city. So it's not efficient. But it also means that it's ready to create the roads that are used most often and make those really big roads. So that's kind of what happens from this point on. We go through synaptic pruning, which is that the used synapses become really strong and really fast, and the ones that aren't used die away. So from toddlerhood to teens, you lose about 20 billion synapses a day. So actually what brain development is the strengthening of really highly used synapses, so they become faster and faster and better and stronger, and the dying away of ones that are inefficient and not necessary. So the benefit is that you have a really fast, efficient brain based on the environment you're in. As a child, I'm born with the ability to hear all these different sounds, but I don't need to hear every O sound that's in every language or every A sound in every language. I need to hear that when all of you make that sound, even though it might be different, I can group it together as the same sound. So that's kind of what's happening in the brain development that allows for this. The downside is that you lose flexibility with age. So the lost synapses, for the most part, don't really return. This is why when you try to learn the language later, you can't hear those things now. You've lost that ability. So what does this mean? What does it mean that the brain's developing this much this quickly? If you're a rabbit, it's not very good. So rabbits raised in captivity have smaller brains than those in the wild. This was first documented by Darwin, who started to look at how environments influence biology and found that the brains were actually smaller, physically smaller. Rats, we've done a whole lot more research on now. If they're in really enriched environments compared to impoverished ones, big differences in their brains in terms of the size of the neurons and the connections between them, the strength of those connections. So what does this mean if you're human? Well, the other rat studies, there's some really neat ones where they also study rats who don't get to, so the environments, the impoverished one is basically just a box, and you don't get to do anything or play with anything. The enriched ones are kind of like, just the most amazing rat cage you could ever imagine. They can move around places and play on wheels and do all these great things. And those brains are really different. But they also found that they've had rats watch the really active rats. So you can see interesting, fun things, but you can't do it. And their brains look like the impoverished ones. So you have to actually do it. They actually have a couple of studies where they've forced rats to follow a really active rat. So they have a really active rat that gets to move around the environment however it wants. And then one that has kind of no free will, it just has to follow the other one. Their brains are actually much more like the impoverished brains. So you have to have the freedom to explore your environment as well to get these benefits. So again, what does this mean then for humans? Obviously for rodents, you don't want scientists messing with you. That's bad. But for humans, what do we know about how this affects it? Well, the main thing is that brains will develop to meet the needs of the environment we're in, and it'll happen really early in life. So if the environment you're in meets what makes a successful environment for you, you're going to do really well. So you want that environment to be as similar to what's happening in your later environment. If it doesn't match it, if the environment you're in doesn't have a lot of language, doesn't have a lot of aspects that will be necessary for success, it's going to be a real problem. So popular press has kind of taken this another way, though. So basically, the thing that comes across in some of the popular press has been, after 3, you lose brain. And we don't want to lose brain. You've got to keep brain. So they've actually had these proponents of, give as much stimulation as you can to infants. That's not right. And this has actually been quoted by pediatricians in Newsweek. You don't want to give just tons of stimulation. You don't want to sit there with flashcards making all these different language sounds so that your baby gets those. You want your baby to be in the environment that fits the environment they'll need, which for most loving, caring families is perfect. Talking to the kids a lot, playing with them a lot, giving them new experiences. It doesn't cost a lot of money, but that will give them the ideas of what they need. Now, there's been a counter-argument to this, too, that goes the opposite way, where there was a neuroscientist that was called during all of this, and he was asked by a reporter from Newsweek, what does this mean? And what would you say, what would you say to a parent trying to pick a preschool for their kid? And he said, based on what we know, absolutely nothing. And she was like, no, you don't understand. If the brain's going away, then what can parents do? And he said, well, don't raise your child in a box. Or at least give them a really nice hamster wheel if they're in there. So he had this idea that, it didn't matter as much in humans. And it does. Humans are actually pretty good, though, at bouncing back. In the cases that come as close to this as we can find, which are orphanages, that we have in Eastern Europe and in China, amazingly, most of those children who are in really deprived early environments almost match the kids that are in much more enriched environments for those few years. A lot of them catch up and do well. Not all of them, though. So the environment matters. But there's kind of a give and take. It doesn't mean you have to go out and buy everything that will teach your kid every possible thing before they start losing brain. You can kind of work those. So most environments aren't really as extreme as these animal studies, but environment definitely matters, and matters a lot. So the question then becomes, what do we need to become successful in our environment? And how can we make sure that their kids are able to get those benefits and get them early enough so that it will help in their language development? What we find is how the environment matters is really in the quantity and quality of the language they acquire. As I said, all children will learn language. As long as they're in an environment with it, they will learn language. But what matters to be successful in America is to be really good with language. You have to be able to have long conversations. You have to have a wide vocabulary to really be a successful person in America. So we need to provide environments for children that will allow for them to have those optimal experiences and develop as well as they can. So this has moved us from nurture. Now I'm going from nature to nurture. So we're on the other side now. So what about the environment matters? What have we learned in the last few decades of research about what matters? Well, there's some pretty basic ones that we know matter, that will matter no matter what, which are things like, birth order. So the firstborn tends to have better language than the laterborns. And this is because just like how they get all their pictures taken and everything, they actually get talked to more. And parents provide better models than older siblings. So you think kind of maybe a secondborn gets the parents' language and their older siblings' language. But an older sibling doesn't use as good of language to do this. Now, as a really bitter secondborn, I will also tell you that there are other benefits to being born later. So they do get other cognitive benefits, like learning the world doesn't revolve around them and other people have other beliefs and thoughts. But at least for language and quantity of language, if there's going to be a difference, the firstborns usually benefit from that. Sex matters. So girls generally have better language than boys. Again, we don't always find it, but when we do, it's that girls are better. This is a mix between nature and nurture. Girls are born with more mature brains than boys are. This is probably part of the reason that they acquire language a little bit faster. Girls are also spoken to more than boys. So it's a little bit of both. Once a parent knows, and they've done some of these experiments where it's a baby and they don't know whether it's a boy or a girl, and they treat the baby very differently when they hear whether the baby is a boy or a girl. And one thing is they speak to girls much more. They throw boys around a lot more and are more active, but they speak to girls more. So some of these things we know matter about the environment. Now in 1995, a book came out by Hart and Risley, and it put this big emphasis on the idea that socioeconomic status matters for language development. What they found was that children in homes that are lower socioeconomic status, so less education of the parents and less money, those children had lower vocabularies. So what we've done since then, it's obviously not just, hey, if I have more money in my bank account, my kid will speak better. That doesn't really work. But the environments actually differ. And since then, the original study wasn't really well done. Since then, we've looked a lot more into what about the environment matters. And these are the things I'm going to talk about that we've really pinned down as being important. One is the number of words, but it's not just the number of words. We're going to see that variability and sophistication of words matters a lot, the complexity of the syntax, and then the type of language used. All of these things matter from parents and from teachers. Some of the newer research coming out shows that teachers, if kids come in without benefits of this from the environment, teachers can make a huge impact by using these same features that we see in parents. So I'm going to go into a little more detail on this. This is the original study that we have from Hart and Risley and what they found. They looked in these they grouped their population by high SES, middle, lower SES, and then lower, or what they called welfare. And what you'll see, one, these are really small sample sizes, which is one of the problems people have had. So they had 13 kids coming from the high-income area. And what they found is the kids' vocabulary, this is their vocabulary graph, just continues to, it separates at a very young age and just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, that difference between those vocabularies. Middle-income kids fall right in the middle, and welfare kids are, by about the age of 3, lagging really far behind. So this was their publication, but they also went in to see a little bit of why that was the case. And they found that when they looked at these environments, they actually had a lot of difference in the input that children were getting. And what they did was just count number of words that the kids hear. So they found that in a high-income home, children heard about 11,000 words a day. And in low income, they heard about 7,000 words. So what they did is they projected that out to about the age of 5. And then said, what is the difference in the mass number of words that kids are getting in these different environments? And you'll see in the professional homes, by the age of about 4, they're getting nearly 45 million words that they hear, compared to the welfare homes that they were looking at, where the kids are much more around 15 million by that 4 years. That's a huge gap. And they said part of the reason for what we get later is because of this input that we're getting. This has been shown in other things that even when you take income out, SES out, that this effect still is there. That number of words is really important to children's development. But we've started to study it in more depth and say, well, is it just number of words, or is there something about the quality and the way that parents talk that can matter? And there really is. There are large differences actually on the way parents use language, just not saying lots of words. I have this image. There's actually a little thing you can get that keeps track of the number of words you say to your kids per day. Costs $700 if you want one. If you're willing to buy that, you're probably saying enough words. That's what I want to say. But I have this image of parents at the end of the day like realizing that they haven't said enough words and just shouting words at their kids so that they get the number up really high. So it's not just saying lots of words. The quality of words matters a lot too. And what we found is that one, instructive language and what we call scaffolded language in terms of the communication matter a lot. And you'll see that this kind of gives a range of vocabulary when you have this. So on top I have a good kind of instructional language where if you're at a zoo looking at an elephant, you kind of give a context for that elephant, which will include other vocabulary words that are kind of related. So look, that's an elephant. It comes from Africa. They live with giraffes and lions. And now they kind of have a context. They've heard this word giraffe. When they get to the giraffes, they'll have already heard it. It kind of helps them build. It gives a foundation for learning words and learning vocabulary. You can say almost the same number, but give nowhere near as much detail and not be as helpful by saying, an elephant, see that? He's a big elephant. Look at the elephant. Well, that's nowhere near as helpful. And there are a lot of parents in high SES across the board that use this, and their children's language is not as well developed. The other is scaffolding. So actually getting children to respond with a variety of answers. Where did we go yesterday? What did we do there? Who did you see? You kind of saw that in Raksha even talking to her 2-year-old in the earlier video, trying to get her to give a range of language when she responds. This type of language is much more helpful to children as well in building their vocabulary. I have videos of this that I found on YouTube, and I felt bad showing it here, but just because the kids and not trying to promote that. But I do show it in my class, so I want to say that if you ever think it's a good idea to put you and your kid talking on YouTube, I may download it and critique your parenting skills. So I will never critique the children, but I will critique the parents. So I didn't want to show that necessarily, but you see wide ranges of differences between these, where some parents really give a lot of information and build that foundation for their kids, and others just don't. So we see large differences in this type of language. Now, when it comes to syntax and how syntax develops, I've gone really long. Am I OK? OK. Sorry, I realized that. When we get to syntax, the development's a little bit, or we see similar ways of development. Does parent syntax relate to children's syntax? And one of these studies actually grouped parents based on the type of syntax they use, either using really simple word order, she hugged him, we went there, really simple sentences, compared to complex word order with their kids. So she was hugged by him, or where you put in clauses, she hugged him because she loved him, kind of expanding it. And then they looked at the kids' syntax. Are they able to do this? Well, what was impressive is for kids' simple word order, it didn't matter what they heard. So in all these three groups, all of these kids could put words together, right? Language development. They get it. They get grammar. They can put words together. Input doesn't matter. But when you looked at kids' complex syntax, it mattered a lot. So that parents who aren't using complex stimuli or sentences have kids that also don't produce complex sentences. So we get this same idea that all kids will acquire language, but the quality of that language differs by the environment. So being able to produce complex sentences is very important to getting into schools, understanding the if, then, because types of sentences and being able to produce them. So we get language. You're going to get language. You're going to get grammar. The quality is going to differ based on the environment. So one of the other things we've started to find is that this is also true of teachers, that all of these same factors matter for teachers in the environment and in the classroom, to the point where it actually doesn't matter very much what kids, when they come in, they can be vastly different. They will all benefit. They will benefit a lot from the teacher input. So if you're not a parent, but you are someone working with kids constantly, this is the type of thing that you should be doing with the language that you have to really help them. So, and I realize I'm going over a little bit, so I'm going to give you a summary here and not bash baby Einstein, so I'll leave that out. If you'd like to hear why Einstein is bashed, yeah, I can answer that. So should I go on and talk about baby Einstein? OK. All right, so I will go ahead and bash baby Einstein, who's now giving refunds if you have their stuff. So this is the claim made by Baby Einstein Language Nursery, or originally it was. I think they've probably changed the wording. So research has shown that infants have a natural ability to distinguish and assimilate the sounds of all languages, but this ability begins to fade as babies grow older. All true, right? With this in mind, the audio component of Baby Einstein was crafted to expose infants to a multitude of phonemes in a fun, baby-friendly way. There are more than 100 phonemes, not all of which are present in any single language. According to research, repeated exposure to these sounds will form dedicated connections in the brain's auditory cortex. So what you have here are a couple things that I did say are true, right? So the phonemes, that we lose that ability to hear those phonemes, absolutely true. That part of the reason is because of brain development, definitely true. You lose that ability, that's true. The big component that they add here that is not a good one is that you can acquire this from audio or from TV. That is not true. So when we actually look at this, the research now on learning from TV, and a lot of this is just starting to come out, but it's coming out over and over and over again, is that in infancy, TV, even educational TV, does not help and may actually hurt language development. Kids love it. They will sit in front of it. It's baby crack, but it is not good for them. So it's actually gotten to the point, there are a couple of studies I referenced, one of them that actually showed that every hour in front of the TV, regardless of the type of TV, led to less vocabulary in those kids. But now we're at the point, and other studies have shown similar things, or no effects, but definitely no benefits. The American Academy of Pediatrics has now recommended no TV at all for any children under the age of 2. Now, when we get up to preschoolers, it's a little different. Preschoolers can learn from TV. They benefit a lot more if they're watching the TV with their parents and interacting and talking about it. And they actually benefit more from no TV and just talking to their parents. But they can learn from TV, from Dora and from Sesame Street. They found these. So this is one of the big issues. The other is the claim that baby Einstein makes. And this has actually been specifically studied in an experiment I like a lot. Can infants retain second language phonemes through just audio or through TV? This was studied by Pat Kuhl, and she had native English speakers who only spoke English, infants, come into her lab for like an hour once a week, twice a week, and talk to her, or basically just kind of be engaged with her RAs, who are her research assistants or graduate students, who spoke Mandarin Chinese fluently. They were from China, spoke Mandarin fluently. And it's almost like if you had your grandmother who speaks another language watching your kid once a week and interacting with them. And so she had these live interactions, and then she also had other babies watch those interactions on TV or just listen to them. And just like baby Einstein, what looks kind of boring, the babies loved it. They watched it nonstop. So the question was, can children retain, English-speaking children in English-speaking homes, retain these differences that are in Mandarin but not in English? So when we look at the actual graphs of what happened, these are Chinese learning babies and English learning babies and their ability to distinguish these sounds just in their homes. These are kids from China, kids from America. Chinese-speaking kids, this is 10 to 12 months of age, are much better at differentiating these phonemes. We would expect that. The American infants doing live interactions with the parents look almost like Chinese speakers, or live interactions with the research assistants. And that's true only like an hour once a week during this period. It doesn't take a lot, but they maintain it compared to the kids that come in and play but speak English when they come in and play. So then the real question is what happens with audio and with video. And those kids look identical to no exposure at all. They watch just as much, engage just as much, but absolutely retain nothing from it. And they loved it. So they heard it. But what's interesting is that infant development requires social interaction. Just hearing that stuff from the background is not going to teach you anything. You have to actually engage with someone. So baby Einstein should not be your baby's teacher. There are other companies that make similar claims. And baby Einstein, as I said, has retracted this and is now offering refunds for their stuff, saying that they never claimed it was educational. So you can get your money back if you spend, I think they're giving $12 on the DVD, which is nowhere near what they cost. So that's really all I wanted to talk about. I hope that I was able to distinguish language from popular science, what we actually know from the popular science. And while it's almost inevitable that children will acquire language, we can really change the quality of that language through the environment and through some really specific ways of interacting in the environment. But you don't need to spend lots of money on fancy science-based stuff. Kids interacting with parents is the best interaction they can have. So that's kind of the best way to promote it. And that's it. Sorry I went over. I'm sorry about that.
That was very, very interesting. Thank you so much. I think what I'm going to do, we have a reception. Should we take questions or should we?
It's not 10:30.
Okay, we have time for a few questions. And then after that, for those of you who don't get your questions answered, we have a reception that is going on, and Mandy is going to remain around and she can talk to you in a more informal way. And before I open it up for questions, I also want to make a couple of announcements. First, I want to introduce Dr. Margaret Owen, who is the director of the Center for Children and Families, and really very much responsible for very much of what goes on here. The other thing that I wanted to do, I had received questions before we got started on whether there are continuing education credits available. We do have those credits available for speech-language pathology or audiology. And if you need those, on the registration table that you saw when you came in, you can pick up one of these forms and, in order to get credit. In addition, if you came to prior talks where you registered and we have documentation that you were here, you can get a form for a prior talk as well. We hope to be able to expand that to other professions as we go on, but this is what we were able to do for now. Okay, so let's get some questions. Yes?
Hi. My grandson just turned 2, and he is the only child at the moment. And my daughter-in-law taught him sign language. Okay. And when she taught him, obviously she spoke the word. And at this stage, he can say ball very nicely. He can make a few sounds, but he's not really talking. And this is my daughter-in-law's got everything that she needs, for a wonderful learning environment. The only thing is, I think he doesn't interact enough with maybe other children. Okay. And as a grandmother, it's tough to say anything or what to do.
Yes.
So what is really normal? I have 3 sons who are brought up who've done wonderful. I mean, it's natural to read, maybe not so much TV and interact, no computers. Father busy typing on a computer or mother busy checking email and all this stuff.
One of the slides I took out that I did have originally, but I was already feeling like I had a lot, was what is a normal range of production for about a 24-month-old. And the normal range is between 50 words and 550 words, all as being completely normal. From what you've said, it's your granddaughter? Grandson. Is he using signing? They've done a lot of research now on signing, and that was a big concern, could signing hinder my child's language development, or will it help it? What are the impacts? And they actually, some of the original studies seem to show it didn't hurt it at all. But the original study said it wasn't much of a benefit. What it did as a benefit was it really helped communication between the parent and the child. It's a lot easier to create this as a sign than say the words more by motor abilities. What they're finding now is it's actually beneficial, that teaching signs does seem to help children acquire language. Not by a whole lot, but it helps. So what I would say is if he is producing signs and understands what's said to him, those are really good signs. And he may just be a little slower in producing the language. You hit a certain point if he gets to where he's not really taking off on the language development after a couple more months, you might want to talk to a speech therapist or a doctor. But if he's understanding signs and producing them, he's got symbolic communication. And that's really that core. The ability to actually produce the words may be coming behind a little bit. But signing, you saw Raksha doing it too. She was doing this as driving. They found both spontaneous signs in kids. There are some kids that just sign a lot and have meanings that they have for those words. And teaching signs seems to be indications of, or seems to help promote language development a little bit. So from what you've said, I would say he may be just a little bit on the delayed end of production. But if he's understanding what's said and producing signs, at this point it may not be, I don't think it's a problem. The environment of signing they've done a lot of work on it now, and it actually seems to really help. And it does, if you talk to parents, it helps them a lot. That communication really, they feel like it eases, instead of the child just crying, they can sign what they want. So that seems to help. Sure.
And obviously social interaction is very important for that, of course.
It is. Well, some of the studies, actually what I know most about this comes from the NICHD study, so more of whether children are in childcare or not and how much interaction they have. And my understanding is if they're in a pretty social, if they're interacting with their parents and doing that, the impact isn't actually that large on the differences between them, from what I know. So it shouldn't matter that much that he's not interacting much with kids. Now, social development or some of those other aspects may, but for language development, it shouldn't be much of an issue. But, sure.
That was a great talk.
Thanks.
I really enjoyed it. But it made me start to think about the distinction between communication and language.
Yeah.
Because you started off with those great cute puppy pictures and saying, look, they're communicating, but this isn't language. And then you transitioned into gorillas non-verbally communicating, which you called language, right?
They called it language, yes. The people working with them call it language.
They are signing, which is non-verbal communication, but I kind of get confused what the distinction is, and it seems like it's some kind of social aspect which distinguishes the two, but I wanted to hear your thoughts.
It's a really good question. It's one that's debated a lot, actually, and different people, depending on what they want to be true, will change the definition of what's language compared to what's just communication. You can have communication without language, language without communication. But what we consider, where most people draw the line, is that idea of generativity and being able to create new meanings. That's what makes something language. Communication, being able to communicate one or two things, using symbols even. There's a dog, Rico, that can use mutual exclusivity and knows hundreds of words. But it wouldn't be what we would consider language. So communication we see in many, many different species. That's really common across the animal world. The ability to create new meanings, we don't. So a dog can say, I'm angry at this thing, I'm angry at that thing, I'm angry at that thing, but they can really only talk about being angry and happy and not talk. I always say that. Can make symbols that say that they're doing that. But that inability to talk about things, one, that aren't present, so talk about what happened yesterday, talk about religion or God or quantum physics, things that you can't see, not possible in species, and the ability to just create a new meaning, that I'm not just going to take what my mom said and say it to someone else, but I'm going to create something completely new.
Okay, so that's why signing can be language.
Signing is absolutely language.
Distinguished from, okay.
Now,
So
NIM signing...
It might not be language if they're not showing the generativity.
Exactly. So Coco, the real argument has been that the argument against Coco having language has been the idea that Coco's never created novel connections between words. The owners say she has, the other people say she hasn't. With Chimsky, Nim Chimpsky, that was what he came up with putting words together. So it could be considered language. He had the me orange, give me orange. You could consider that language, but he's never really created a new meaning. He's talked about how he wants an orange, and you're the one to give it to him because he's going to eat it. But there's nothing about the orange yesterday or the orange tomorrow or how oranges are his favorite. So do you want to add to that?
I can't help it.
Okay.
One of the distinction that I think that's really important to make that gets lost is that we call any use of gestures sign language. Yeah. And for example, like with the baby sign, they make a good point, a distinction. These are baby signs. We're concatenating signs one after another in order to establish some communication. But that doesn't yet have syntax, and that doesn't then have language. So with they call the gorilla and chimpanzee language sign language, but it's signing. It's the use of manual symbols, but it lacks, for me, it's the syntax which creates generativity. And I think it's just kind of calling sign language. I mean, people who speak American Sign Language would be offended if you said that what Coco was doing was sign language, because that's their full language. So.
No.
I think that we're going to have to cut it off, and I can tell that this was, everybody enjoyed it as much as I did, and that Mandy will be around and can answer questions for you. And I make two more announcements. One is, again, to remind you of the reception. We have some refreshments out in the hall, and we will be hanging out to talk to you and answer your questions. The second thing is to invite you to our next talk, which is actually the remaining two talks in the series are on your evaluation form.
Here.
There was
It's right here.
on the slide up here.
Oh.
So the next one is April 16th in 3 weeks.
Oh, and
That will be
September
by
26th. That's the
Dr. Anne Van Cleef.
The date's wrong, though.
This one on the form.
Oh, the form is right. Which one's right?
April 16th.
So this is April 16th, and then April, the Melanie Spence talk is actually in May. So don't look at those slides, look at your evaluation form, and please join us for the reception and in 3 weeks to learn about book learning. Thank you. Thank you.
We'll close that.